Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Spiral Dynamics Integral Live. Today we have Nish Dubashia with us. He's going to speak to us about the diamond model, which he has talked to us about before and has given many wonderful talks about, and each time he seems to add another interesting dimension to it. And today he's going to go into it a little further. Well, first of all, I should mention that the diamond model kind of describes the relationship between wholeness and multiplicity and the arising delusion of fragmentation and the realization of non-duality. So in this particular talk, Nish is going to give us some insights into how this applies to the main 8 stages of growing up, as is used in integral theory, but it correlates with the spiral dynamics stages, as well as the idea of waking up, the 4 main stages of waking up, which is something that's described in different ways in various spiritual traditions. So Nish has been a student and practitioner of various spiritual traditions for over 30 years, and he's written several very fascinating books like Gifted, Dancing with Angels, and the Unity of Everything. And with that, I hand it over to Nish. Nish.
Thank you very much, Veronica. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I think I know quite a lot of you. So, yeah, thank you, Veronica. So I'll start by sharing the screen. This is usually the most challenging part of the entire presentation. Okay, so what I'm hoping to do today, many of you have some familiarity with the diamond model. So what I'm hoping to do today is to use the diamond model and see if it can give some interesting perspectives. And forgive my screen is going funny there. Just give it about 30 seconds and it will calm down. What I'm hoping to do today is to see if the diamond model can give us just some interesting perspectives on the processes of growing up and waking up, and to see how the different components of the diamond model, which I'll introduce briefly in a moment, we can see how these change as we develop through the spiral and as we move through the waking up stages as well. And by looking at that, we can hopefully get some insight into how our perspectives into the various aspects of our experience, like wholeness, multiplicity, who we are as subject, what we perceive as object, what we suffer as fragmentation, how these change and transform as we develop and evolve. So hopefully that's the kind of insight we'll get from what I'm hoping to do today. So a very quick introduction to the diamond model. Again, I know that many of you are already familiar with this, but for those who aren't, I'll give a quick overview of the diamond model. Now, I created this model a long time ago, and what I was aiming to do was to try to show perhaps the simplest way that we can look at and understand reality, using pretty much as few components as we can. My sources were theoretical physics. I was lucky enough to know David Bohm, so I drew on some of his work. On integral theory, it wasn't called integral theory then, but the work of Ken Wilber in the 80s and 90s, and the spiritual traditions, particularly the ones I'm most familiar with, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity. So I'll run through this model briefly, just to give an idea of what it's trying to get across, and then we'll start looking at how it can apply to helping us to understand the process of growing up. And I'll start with growing up. So if you begin just by looking at just 2 levels up from the bottom where it says multiplicity. By multiplicity, I simply mean this is the world of separate things and events in which we move about and do things, and that's just the world. Most people's view, that's simply the world in which we live, 3-dimensional world of space and time, made up of different objects, different experiences, different moments. That's multiplicity. And one of the essential insights from these different sources that I drew upon is that there is, or seems to be, some kind of underlying unity that we can experience that underlies the whole of this multiplicity, a oneness, a wholeness, out of which this multiplicity emerges, back into which it dissolves. And that I've simply referred to that as the whole. That's known in different traditions as unity, oneness, void, emptiness, Brahman, the Tao, the Godhead, and so on. Now, one of the suggestions in some of the traditions, in many of the traditions, is that many of the problems that we perceive and experience in the world and in ourselves arise because we lose sight of this underlying wholeness as we move about and experience the world of multiplicity. So we get ourselves lost in the world of parts and completely forget or lose sight of the underlying unity that is in some sense the truer condition of this world of apparent multiplicity. And when that happens, according to this model, and this is drawing heavily on the work of David Bow, we fall from multiplicity, a healthy multiplicity, which in itself is no problem, into a world of fragmentation. The parts become fragments. Healthy parts, healthy meaning we don't lose sight of the underlying whole, we don't lose sight of the interconnection between the parts. Those parts become fragments in our perception. And when that happens, almost inevitably the different parts clash against each other, whether internally, between people, between ideas, between countries, between races, and so on. I think just turn on your news and you can see 30 minutes of fragmentation there and very little wholeness. Now, one of the things that is considered by these traditions is how does the whole actually become multiplicity? What happens to bring about this emergence of multiplicity from wholeness? And one of the suggestions in these traditions is that there is an intermediate stage, an intermediate level between wholeness and multiplicity that they variously refer to as, for example, the subtle level. And one of the primary things that happens at the subtle level is that we create some kind of sense of a separate self or a separate subject that exists separate to and over and above an object or an objective world. This is our fundamental self-contraction. We create ourselves, our sense of self, as separate from the rest of the whole. And that leads to what Ken Wilber refers to as the primary dualism between the subject and the object. And then that subject and object dualism proliferates. We continue to separate over and above this initial separation to create this world of multiplicity, this world of separate parts. But the creation of the subject is the first part, the first multiplicity that we create. That's the suggestion here in this model. And experientially as well, many people have found we can experience this in deep meditation, that that's the first primary separation that we make. Ultimately, though, there is no real ultimate separation between the whole and multiplicity, between wholeness and multiplicity. They're ultimately not two, they're ultimately not different. And that's referred to as non-duality, which you can see there at the top of the page. That's, if you like, the level of enlightenment. That's the final realization that all of this is a play on non-separation, non-separation between the whole and the part, non-separation between the subject and the object. And what this model is suggesting is that these two dualisms, whole and part, subject and object, are the two primary dualisms that make up our experience. They're the two primary dualisms in the lens through which we observe reality and create reality. Philosophically speaking, the separation between the whole and the part is ontological. That's how we separate reality within itself. And the separation between the subject and object is epistemological. That's how we create the knowing subject that then knows the object. And that's the diamond there. That's why this is called the diamond model. The process whereby the wholeness becomes multiplicity and then potentially becomes fragmentation is we can refer to as the process of creation. And the process whereby we are invited at any rate to rediscover, to heal fragmentation, to rediscover wholeness in the midst of multiplicity, I'm referring there as evolution. So that's the diamond model in a 5 to 10 minute summary. Now, my suggestion is that this fundamental shape, this diamond, occurs and can be seen and perceived in almost any context of experience, because it is such a basic fundamental lens through which we both create and observe and experience reality. So what I'm going to attempt to do now is to go slowly through the 8 stages of growing up as described by the spiral dynamics model, and show from beige to turquoise, and show how this diamond could be seen to show up at each of these stages. And this is very tentative. There are probably better ways to do this, but this is a first go at this. So please feel free when we have our discussion to suggest enhancements and improvements or better ways to do this. So I'm going to start with beige. Now, what I'm also going to do, drawing on the work of Peter Merry, my friend Peter Merry, and I think he's drawing perhaps on Don Beck here, I'm not certain, is I'm going to also try to use a simple phrase that describes perhaps the prime directive of that stage. What is that stage basically trying to do? Or what is a simple summary of what that stage is all about? And then based on that, I'm going to suggest how the diamond, this diamond structure, shows up at that stage. And then I will talk about very briefly some of the factors that bring about the transition to the next stage and the emergence of the next diamond, which will, I think we'll see as we progress, be a more complex diamond, showing that we, in some sense, increase in complexity. Our lenses become more complex as we develop. In integral language, less span, more depth as we develop through these stages. And hopefully that will show up in the way this diamond, which we can think of as a fractal, morphs into different shapes as it moves through these different stages. So beige, this is the very basic level where we are basically engaging in sensing and reacting. We sense the world and we react, often unconsciously, instinctively. So wholeness here, now wholeness, recall the diamond model, wholeness is 2 stages down, and multiplicity is 2 stages up, and fragmentation is at the bottom. You bear that in mind as I go through these diamonds. That'll help just to orient what I'm doing here. So wholeness at beige is basically the natural and instinctive world. This is just the world that we perceive through our senses, the natural world, and we're living in this natural world largely through instinct. This is a pre-conceptual stage of development. We're not doing very much in terms of image making, symbolic thinking, conceptual thinking. That hasn't really arisen yet. We're living by instinct. So the world, the wholeness that we perceive and experience at this level is the natural and instinctive world. The subject and object distinction that arises from this natural and instinctive world, the subject is the automatic and instinctive organism. Where we have a physical organism, it's largely reacting automatically and instinctively to whatever is going on in each moment. In our minds, we're able to create images, very simple images, but we haven't yet evolved to a symbolic consciousness. So we can, maybe visualize a tree, but we have no generic symbol for tree yet. So this is image making, perception, sensation perception, no symbolic consciousness yet. That's the subject at this stage. And the object at this stage is our natural environment, trees, rivers, mountains, other humans, other animals. And if you see in the middle there, I've said part of, and I've said that because even though I'm making a separation here between subject and object for the purpose of this model, the experience of somebody at this stage is that they're deeply embedded in their natural environment. They haven't yet developed a very strong sense of separate self or ego that does develop at later stages, a couple of stages after this. So that's what's happening here. Automatic, instinctive organism, part of the natural environment. And the multiplicity that is generated through their interaction is a world of sensory objects and a world of instincts. That's the multiple world in which we live. Sensory objects around us, and we're instinctively reacting to that, sense and react. And when we fail to behave, to react and behave in this world of sensory objects in a way that's in harmony with that wholeness of natural and instinctive world, we fall into fragmentation. At this level, fragmentation is simply a failure to survive. You will simply die if you fall into fragmentation at this level, because you're not doing what you need to do to survive at this natural and instinctive world in which you're now living. The total non-duality at this stage is simply what I've called nature. This is simply the sensory world of nature. And there's no ultimate separation between that and the proto-individual who's living in this world through the perception of sensory objects and instincts. We have a process of creation whereby the world as we experience it at this stage arises out of the natural world, and a process of dissolution. I used to call that destruction. Thanks to Veronica's great suggestion a few talks ago, I've changed that to dissolution. That is dissolution. The world of sensory objects and instincts dissolves back into the natural and instinctive world in this process. Now, one of the things that brings about a transition to the next stage, to the next diamond, I'm going to talk in diamond language now, to the next diamond, is that an instinctual realization occurs that it's very difficult to survive independently here in this way, and that a need to belong to a group starts to emerge. And so we get our first transition from that individual stage to the collective stage. And when that happens, we move to the purple diamond. Now, the purple diamond, the prime directive here, it sounds like something out of Star Trek. The prime directive here is nurture and sustain. That's the prime directive here at purple. So wholeness, two stages down, sorry, not stages, mustn't use words like stages and levels. 2 lines down here is the animistic and magical universe. That's the wholeness at purple. We now live in a universe that's animistic and magical. Rocks and rivers and mountains, they're all filled with spirit. Everything starts to resonate with some kind of spiritual presence now at this level. And we've started to separate ourselves from that, but we're still deeply embedded. And so we have this magical relationship with our environment. So wholeness here is the animistic and magical universe. And the subject and object that arises here, well, the subject here is the membership self. As a tiny little bit of self now starts to emerge in comparison to beige, but it's still not a truly separate ego. It's a self that is defined and experienced almost entirely in terms of being a member of the group, family, clan, tribe, membership self. And that membership self, as the subject, is a part of the object, which is the natural mystical order of things. So we have the membership self and the natural mystical order, and their interplay creates a world of multiplicity there, which is the world of tribes and the world of spirits. The world of belonging to a tribe and placating the spirits. Because we now live in this magical universe, and because we see difficult things happening around us, people dying, people falling sick, our tribe being invaded by other tribes. How do we deal with that? Well, we have to, because we live in a magical universe of spirits, we have to get those spirits to assist us. We placate the spirits. That's how we survive in this magical universe. The spirits help us to survive, help our tribe to survive. So multiplicity here, tribes and spirits to which we belong and which we placate. And when our tribes and our spirits become dislocated or enter into some kind of disharmony with that underlying wholeness, that animistic and magical universe, we fall into fragmentation. And fragmentation here, a couple of examples, closed boundaries. Our tribes can become very closed boundaries in relation to other tribes. And as far as spirits are concerned, we can move into a state of excessive fear of these spirits. So these are just 2 examples. There are other examples we could give, but those are 2 examples of fragmentation here at purple. And again, we have a process of creation as the magical universe manifests as these tribes and spirits, a process of dissolution as the multiplicity of tribes and spirits dissolves back into this animistic and magical universe. So that's the purple diamond. Now, As the purple diamond reaches its maturity, some more transition factors come into play. What consciousness, because this whole thing we can think of as the journey of consciousness, consciousness starts to realize that its individualism is being suppressed. It starts to get an intuition of separate self, separate ego, and that separate ego is being in some sense suppressed by this membership self, by being defined purely in terms of the membership self. And we start to get an emerging identity as separate ego. And then that brings us to the next stage, the next diamond, which is the red diamond. At the red level, the red diamond, the prime directive here is individuate and act. We now identify ourselves as individuals, and as individuals, we intend to act, and we act. That's the prime directive. So the level of wholeness here is a world navigated by sense and impulse. So we're beginning now to develop conceptual thinking. At beige, there was image making. At purple, we were creating symbols, which was at a more abstract level than images, but not quite yet concepts. Red is where conceptual thinking starts to begin. It's still not complex, rational thinking, but concepts do start to emerge in consciousness now. So wholeness here is a world that's navigated by sense and also by impulse. Red is a level that's very impulsive. Now that we've developed or are developing our sense of individual self, that individual self starts to act very impulsively. We haven't yet reached the stage where we can control that individual self very well. That comes later. Here, the individual self is navigating its world through sense and through impulse. And like the purple world before it, the world is both material and non-material. There's a material world, and it still retains its belief and experience of some kind of non-material world, although its way of interpreting that now changes, as we'll see. The subject and the object here at this level, the subject is now very significant. We've now developed, or we now begin to develop, the ego for the first time. And the ego, the basic script of the ego is I determine. I'm going to determine what I do. I'm going to determine my actions, my destiny. It's all about me. It's all about I. Consciousness gets quite enamored by this new realization of separate egohood, of separate selfhood. And the objective world here, the object, because one is now a very separate self, with almost nothing else holding it together except its own self-determination, the world is largely seen as a threat because this separate self can die. So the world now is seen as a jungle in which there is the need for the survival of the fittest. And the ego says, that's going to be me. I intend to survive. So there is subject now as ego, determining its own actions, largely by impulse. World as a jungle, where the law of the jungle is survival of the fittest. And that's the jungle in which the ego wants to survive. Interplay of ego and the world as a jungle, we get our world of multiplicity. And the main way, or the primary way, in which classical red perceives the world of multiplicity is it's a set of healthy opportunities for its own power and its own gratification. That's the world of multiplicity in which the ego now moves about and attempts to survive and thrive. And there are healthy ways to do this. And multiplicity is representative of the healthy way to seek power and gratification, which from an integral point of view, even power and gratification, they have their healthy place in the overall scheme of things, in the overall spiral. But when this world of healthy opportunities for power and gratification falls into fragmentation by becoming too much divorced from the wholeness, this whole world of sense and impulse, what we get are unhealthy manifestations of power, such as oppression, and unhealthy manifestations of gratification, such as rape or violence. Now, again, the non-duality here is simply this entire realm of existence where it's all about power, my power to survive, to gratify, to engage in this world as I determine. Existence is power. That's that entire realm of non-duality here at red. So on the left there, we have a process of ego emergence, as the ego emerges out of this sensory and impulsive world, and a process of enfoldment as there is a rediscovery of wholeness at this level. So that's red. Now, as happens at every level, red reaches some level of maturity, and then there is the eros is at work. There is a desire to evolve further. And what are the transition factors here? One of the great experiences of being a soul ego that's determining its own destiny, and that's purely what one is at red, is that fear of death starts to become a big deal at the higher echelons of red, because I think red consciousness here starts to realize, oh, I'm just this separate self, and the separate self can die and it can suffer. So I think at the higher echelons of red, a desire emerges for security and belonging. And that emerges largely and is driven largely by fear of death as this separate ego, which is now one subject here at red. And in response to these transition factors, this desire for security and belonging, fear of death, once again, the diamond morphs into its next shape, which is blue. And the basic prime directive at blue is oversee and organize. Let's bring some control and organization to this mayhem of separate egos wandering around all over the place, creating chaos. Oversee and organize. Now, one of the principles of the way consciousness works, especially in its perception of reality, is that its understanding of the way reality works is largely a projection of its own self-understanding and its own prime directive. So if the prime directive at blue here is to oversee and organize, then blue consciousness projects this prime directive onto the reality around it and creates and perceives a world that is being overseen and organized. And it's being overseen and organized by various authority figures in the world, but ultimately the whole of reality is being overseen and organized by some kind of absolute authority. And I'm taking one way of doing this, and there's other ways of doing this, but I'm taking the more Western Christian, Jewish, Islamic examples here, rather than the more Eastern examples, is that the absolute overseeing and organizing authority here is the absolute authority of God. So that's the wholeness here, the absolute authority, God, who oversees and organizes the whole universe. Now, the separation into subject and object, there's 2 or 3 ways we could do this. We could see a separation of the subject as soul and the object as body, or the object as the world, or ontologically, which is how I've done it here, we have a separation of reality into the higher world, heaven, and the lower world, earth. So that's not strictly subject and object, but it is still the basic idea of the one becoming the two, becoming the many, which is one of the insights of the diamond here. So taking an example from the Abrahamic traditions and how they perceive reality here at blue. The absolute authority God creates these 2 domains, the higher world, heaven, and the lower world, earth. And together they constitute and generate multiplicity, which is a divinely controlled, orderly, and purposeful world that at the level of multiplicity is aligned with God. For there to be healthy multiplicity at blue, the universe, all aspects of it, must be in alignment with the ground of all being, the absolute authority here, which is God. obey God, and everything will be okay. But when, according to the blue way of looking at the world, when reality is not aligned with God, and I'm drawing more now on the Christian tradition, simply because that's the one I know the best, that divinely controlled, orderly, purposeful multiplicity becomes a fallen world. Creation rejects God, it's no longer aligned with God, and we move into a fallen world. And that's the fragmentation here at this level. All problems, to a religious thinker, believer at this stage, all problems ultimately come from rejecting God. That's their version of fragmentation, their experience of fragmentation. And the non-duality here is simply when there is an absolute and conforming alignment between God and the world. That's the totality here at blue. So on the left there, you can see we've got a process of creation whereby God creates all of this stuff, all of creation, and then creation falls into the fallen world. And on the right, we have a process of salvation whereby the world realigns itself with God. We realign ourselves with this ultimate overseeing and organizing principle. And of course, this prime directive carries out at every level here. We oversee and organize our own lives. We oversee and organize our families, our societies, our countries, the world, and then we project that onto God, who is overseeing and organizing the whole of the universe. So blue projects this prime directive on the way it experiences reality at every one of these levels, from the smallest to the biggest. A significant percentage of the Earth is still, of the human population, is still largely centered at this way of looking at things. Now, as blue reaches its maturity and its the end of its life, some transition factors come into play. There are many of these. I've just chosen two examples. One of these is more knowledge. As we get more knowledge about how the world really works in a third person, from a third person objective point of view, we find that many of the beliefs that are here at blue actually don't hold up to the evidence, to what we're actually seeing and testing. And we might also start to perceive some real contradictions in our blue beliefs, contradictions within the beliefs themselves, contradictions more damagingly between how people who promote these beliefs preach and how they actually behave. So our perception of blue as this perfect representation of how the world works starts to break down at the upper echelons of blue. And that moves us into the next version of the diamond, which is orange. Now, the prime directive at orange is plan and develop. Consciousness now emerges as with the ability to take third-person perspectives. And when we can take third-person perspectives, we're able to plan ahead and we're able to develop things through space and time, because we can take our individual and cultural biases out of the picture and look at things objectively. And that's what we're calling orange. So, the orange diamond. Now, one of the main belief systems, I'm using that term very loosely, one of the main belief systems at orange is empirical science. And so I'm using some of the languaging from empirical science to construct this diamond here at orange. So the world of wholeness at orange is energy. From a scientific point of view, there's only matter and energy. And matter is ultimately just energy condensed in some temporary condensed form. So ultimately, wholeness at orange is this entire universe of energy. And the subject and the object that emerge as things evolve in this world of energy and sentient beings start to emerge. The subject here is the autonomous observer, the observer that's able to take a third-person perspective. Of course, that doesn't happen until very late in our development, but that's what we're working towards in this way of looking at things. and the objective observed, which the autonomous observer can now observe as object through taking a third-person perspective. And when we see that interaction between autonomous observer and objective observed, what we generate is a world of multiplicity, which at Orange is a material world of separate things and events in space and time. Things in space, events in time. That's the world that is generated through this interplay in the third-person perspective between autonomous observer and objective observed. And here, fragmentation is very simply when we make incorrect observations and deductions about the world. Our perception of the world is simply out of harmony with how the world really is. And we fall into fragmentation, which is incorrect observations and deductions. So from an Orange point of view, a lot of our problems happen because we simply know and believe the wrong things. If we just knew everything and understood everything, most of our problems would disappear. That would be the Orange way of looking at things. Ultimately, the non-duality here is that energy and matter are not separate. And that was nicely enshrined in Einstein's equation E equals mc squared. Matter and energy, or the mass of an object, which is correlated with its mass, is really just another form of that energy of which it's ultimately made up. Energy and mass are interchangeable. And this is a relatively recent discovery in the last 100, 150 years. So as energy, on the left there, energy manifests as this material world of separate things and events. And as the universe winds down, which it will likely do in due course, the material world of separate things and events, as well as all observers and observeds, will dissolve back into this original primordial state of energy. How does this relate to planning and developing, which is what we started with? Well, planning and developing basically requires this well-developed third-person perspective that this diamond is aiming to show here. So, transition factors. Now, blue and orange are probably the center of gravity of the planet at the moment. But orange is not the end of the story. There is no end of the story. But what happens as orange reaches its maturity? What are the transition factors that move it into the next stage? Again, several, but a couple of examples. Some kind of existential angst, a loss of meaning, a loss of purpose. If this world is just a material world of separate things and events in space-time, and I've just got to observe it rightly and plan and develop and earn lots of money and do science and get knowledge, and then you die and that's the end of it. Is that it? Where's the meaning and purpose here? I've bought my car, I've bought my house, I'm a success, which is the other side of orange. What happens then? What's the point of it all? I'm bored now. I want some meaning and some purpose. Also, what happens if I have some kind of metaphysical experience here that can't be easily explained with scientific equations and energies and third-person perspectives? What's that all about? So these are the transition factors that can lead to the transformation of the orange diamond into the green diamond. So the prime directive here at green is include and harmonize. So green is all about including everything and including everyone, which includes science, but it now wants to include all these other perspectives as well, because the orange perspective didn't give it the kind of meaning and purpose that it wanted. So let's explore other ways of looking at things, and let's not marginalize anybody, and let's not marginalize any of these views. And let's even find a way to harmonize all of these views together. Green doesn't actually succeed in doing that, as we'll see. But that's what it wants to do. It wants to include and harmonize all these views and all these people, because it wants to get meaning and purpose, which it's not getting from this more singular view that was there at orange. However good orange was and is, it wasn't quite enough. So the level of wholeness, the realm of wholeness here at green, is the holistic and harmonious universe, which is how green perceives the universe. The universe is holistic. It's all one big, beautiful, holistic entity. and it's all ultimately harmonious, except when human beings screw it up. But otherwise, it's this beautiful, holistic, harmonious universe. And the subject and the object that emerge out of this holistic, harmonious universe, the subject is the human being in its totality, not just our third-person perspectives and scientific equations and E equals mc squared and all that nonsense. We now want to include all of our thoughts and all of our feelings, and we want to include all these different perspectives, thoughts, feelings, multi-perspectival cognition. That's what makes up the whole human being. That's the subject here at Green. And the object is, again, the corresponding world in its totality, not just human beings, but all sentient beings. I'm now the cats and dogs and insects and frogs and worms and all non-sentient, even non-sentient entities, rocks and mountains. This is all part of the world to which we belong. It's all precious. It all has rights as much as I do. This is the subject and the object. I'm hoping you can see here that as we're progressing through these diamonds, the subject is getting, in some sense, bigger and bigger, deeper and deeper. And because it is, so is the object that's being perceived and created in perception. That's also getting bigger and deeper as we're moving through these levels. The diamond is increasing in depth. We're getting more and more complex diamond as we grow through these stages. So interaction between this thinking, feeling, and multi-perspectival human being and this sentient and non-sentient world creates a world of multiplicity, and it's now a relativistic world. It's a world made of different things, different events, different worldviews. All of them are valid in their own context. They're all true and right in some sense. We need to respect and include them all and marginalize nobody. This is this relativistic world in which we're living. But when this relativistic world moves out of harmony with wholeness, the holistic and harmonious universe, we move into fragmentation, and the green version of fragmentation is disharmony and inequality. So when we fail to truly and harmoniously include everybody and everything in this beautiful green vision of reality, we move into a disharmony. And disharmony is the real cause here at Green of suffering and fragmentation and war and conflict. And if we fail to truly include all the worldviews and things and events in this relativistic world, we can end up oppressing and marginalizing certain groups of people, certain views, and that can lead to inequality. Inequality is the great crime here at Green. That's the great fragmentation that Green often points to as the root of all evil. So we have a process there on the left of involution, whereby the universe manifests as the human being in the world and the relativistic world of worldviews, and a process of evolution, whereby we can evolve and create greater and greater degrees of holism and harmony. So that's the green diamond. So what are some of the transition factors that bring about the need for another diamond, an even deeper and more complex diamond? Well, one possibility here is a dissatisfaction with the kind of counterculture that Green can bring about. In the 1960s, for example, we saw an explosion of Green. For example, just one example in the hippie movement, very idealistic views about how to save the world. Why is it that never really happened? Why is it 40, 50, 60 years later, it doesn't at least seem to have made very much difference? That's the kind of thinking that can occur at the upper end of Green, a dissatisfaction with Green culture to really deliver the goods. Why has it not really delivered what it promised? Why are we still all blowing each other up? And at an individual level, Green can lead to a couple of rather harmful pathologies. The first of these is nihilism. If every single worldview is good and valid, and none of them are really absolutely better than any other, then what's the ultimate meaning to all this? Apart from all these millions of different ways of looking at things. What's grounding all of this? Why am I really here, apart from whatever worldview I want to make up to make myself feel good? And that can lead to a lack of sense of any kind of meaning, truth, grounding in this universe, in this world, which can lead to nihilism, which can become quite unhealthy and pathological in its extreme forms. The other possible pathology here is narcissism. If all worldviews are equally good, then my worldview, whatever I want it to be, is just as good as yours. So who the hell are you to tell me what to do? If I want to believe that Elvis Presley is living in my loft, that's my worldview. It's just as good or just as bad as anybody else's. So don't you dare tell me what to believe. I'll believe whatever I want. That can lead to narcissism, and does lead to narcissism. It's obvious if you look around that nobody tells me what to do. This is what I believe. Get lost. That's another possible pathology here of green. So these kind of pathologies and this kind of dissatisfaction and maybe disillusionment with green promises to include and harmonize, which never really maybe happened like we might have hoped in the 1960s, can lead to the next shift in the diamond, to the next stage of development, which is yellow. Now we see our the yellow diamond here. And it's probably in the context of the yellow diamond that this entire talk and model and presentation is taking place, hopefully. So the prime directive at yellow, integrate and consolidate. We still maintain the multi-perspectivism of green because each level transcends and includes the previous ones. We don't lose that. But now, instead of seeing these as these fragmented worldviews all over the shop with no connecting pattern that can lead to nihilism and narcissism, we now want to find a way to integrate these views and consolidate these views into some kind of more coherent pattern, if we can. So, wholeness here is the universe is now a complex, self-organizing natural system. We realize that actually things are a lot more complex than we thought. And we start to see that the universe has this capacity to self-organize. And that's actually reflected, and we start to see this at yellow, that's reflected in ourselves and our own development. Subject and object here. The subject here that emerges out of this complex self-organizing natural system is an emergent and evolving self. We now start to see the universe not as God's creation, not as merely a static thing ruled by invariant scientific laws, not as here are a million worldviews, choose which one you like, everything's harmonious. It's actually the universe, we now start to see it as something that's emerging. It's an emerging universe. And myself, as part of that universe, is emerging with it. So the subject here is the emergent, evolving self, and the object here is the emergent, emerging, evolving world. And again, you may recall in some of the very earlier stages, particularly beige and purple, pre-egoic, the self, the subject and the object were not as harshly divided as they became in later stages like red, blue, orange, even green. And the subject was in some sense embedded in the object. It was part of, you can see there in the middle, part of. That was a pre-egoic separation, a pre-egoic embeddedness between the subject and the object, or of the subject in the object. What starts to emerge here in the yellow diamond is another embeddedness again, but it's not merely the same pre-egoic embeddedness, unconscious embeddedness that we saw at beige and purple. But now we experience a trans-egoic conscious embeddedness of the subject in the object, a trans-rational embeddedness rather than a pre-rational embeddedness. The emergent, evolving self is now seen as an integral part of, not in any way absolutely separate from the emergent, evolving world. Separation starts to be transcended rather than separation simply not emerging yet. Big difference, pre and trans. The interplay between the emergent evolving self and the emergent evolving world generates a multiplicity of perspectives. So what we now perceive is a universe of perspectives. But whereas at green, these perspectives were just fragmentary with no connecting pattern, because we're now seeing the universe in terms of emergence, these perspectives are now perceived as implicitly developmental. These perspectives develop, they evolve. The universe is a complex, self-organizing, natural system of implicitly developmental perspectives. When these perspectives fall into fragmentation, when these perspectives that we might be holding move out of harmony with this wholeness of the self-organizing emergent whole, one of the ways that can manifest or be caused by is by a failure to integrate these perspectives. And then we fail to integrate and consolidate, which is the prime directive here. The perspectives become disconnected from one another. They fragment. Possible ways in which this can show itself up are through our shadow projections. When we fail to integrate a perspective, we can project it onto others, and we can react to their perspectives in a rather typical way that psychologists refer to as shadow projections. We can also find ourselves almost irrationally triggered by different perspectives if we have failed to integrate those perspectives. So, for example, if I have failed to integrate blue in my overall system of thinking and feeling, I can be very triggered. I could be very triggered by somebody expressing blue beliefs. Somebody could tell me, oh, but God created the universe, and I could get really annoyed. And the yellow view is that's because I failed to integrate the blue perspective within my own spiral. And I'm projecting that onto this believer and getting angry with him. That's one way in which fragmentation can occur at yellow. We fail to integrate and consolidate. If you think of all the diamonds we've looked at so far, in some sense, fragmentation at every stage is simply a failure to carry out that prime directive. That's what leads to the fragmentation at each level. So on the left there, we see emergence. These perspectives emerge through time, through this complex, out of this complex self-organizing system, and they are enfolded back into this complex self-organizing system. Even yellow, though, does have its limitations, and that also leads to transition factors that lead to the next and final diamond of this particular part of the presentation. One transition factor is that the yellow view, the yellow perspective, can still be very conceptual and intellectual. And as we move to mature yellow, we might start to really understand all of this and even see things really in these terms as we go about our daily life. But we want to feel it more deeply. We want to go beyond just a conceptual and intellectual understanding of all this and really feel it in our being. And we want to reconnect with our body and our emotions, which somewhere along the way, red, blue, orange, got somewhat disconnected, suppressed. And that leads to the next and final transition here in this series, at any rate. If we meet again in 100 years, there'll be a couple more. So we have the final diamond here, which is the turquoise diamond. And the prime directive here is embody and embrace. So the wholeness here is experienced as the universe is now seen not just as a emerging system, but because we now want to truly embody and embrace, we now see the universe as a holistic organism. The universe is a holistic and evolving organism of which we're a part. The subject here, that's our integrated body mind. If we've truly realized turquoise, if we're truly living from turquoise, the body mind has reached a high degree of integration. We have gone beyond concept of intellect. We have reconnected with our bodies and our emotions. And from that subject, which is the integrated body mind, we see and perceive an integrated universe. Remember, at every level here, the object is a reflection of the subject, because there is an underlying wholeness between the two. So that reflection is inevitable by the very nature of things. The subject here is an integrated body mind, and that is part of, deeply embedded now, but very consciously, in an integrated universe. And that interplay between the integrated body mind and the integrated universe creates a world of multiplicity. And I'm going to use integral language here, and I'll try to explain what it means. A world of multiplicity of co-emerging holons. Now, very simply, a holon is something that is a whole made up of parts, and which is itself a part of a bigger whole. So turquoise here now, this is one way, this is not the only way, but one way in which turquoise may start to perceive and experience multiplicity is as a universe made up of holons that are co-emerging in all four quadrants. Now, I'll explain what all four quadrants means for those of you who aren't familiar with integral thinking. In integral thinking, very, very briefly, there are four main domains of experience. There's our subjective experience, which is what we can call the I. There is our cultural experience, which is what we could call the we. There is the objective experience, which Orange Science was all about, which we can call the it. And there is the social experience, which is the its, which Green was largely interested in. At turquoise, we see the universe as always involving all four of these. There's always, for any occasion or moment of experience, there's always a subjective, a cultural, an objective, and a social element, always. And any occasion of experience that involves all of these four simultaneously is a holon, and holons are constantly emerging as this holistic organism that is the universe is constantly emerging and evolving. And in technical language, in technical integral language, what we say is these holons are tetra arising in all four quadrants. Fragmentation here is when we fail to integrate these four quadrants. Now, these four quadrants, these different aspects of our experience, are all seen as being part of this integrated world, an integrated subject and object. And if we fail to integrate these in some way or another, we're going to fall into some kind of fragmentation. So if we, for example, I've given 4 examples there. If we, for example, fail to, or if we give too much importance or an imbalanced importance to one of these quadrants and fail to integrate the other 3, we can fall into some kind of pathology, which manifests as some kind of imbalance in our own integrated body mind and the way in which we perceive the integrated universe. So there are just 4 examples there. I won't go into detail, but there are 4 examples there. The subjective not being embedded in the universe, postmodern constructivism, scientism, system reductionism. These are ways in which we can fail to integrate all 4 quadrants and fail to have this truly integrated body-mind view, all 4 quadrant view of the cosmos. So that's the final stage of growing up. So what I'm thinking is, before we move on to waking up, which is the second part of the presentation, shall I stop the share and let's have a break of a couple of minutes and if anyone has any questions or comments, and then we can move on to the waking up rather than going into that immediately. How does that sound?
Hi, I just want to compliment you on the way that the diamond has evolved. I can see sort of a variety of nuances that you've added, and I feel like that in terms of the essence anyways of what is meant by all those pieces and the descriptions, etc., that it's really going to a deeper level. So I want to appreciate that for you. I appreciate you for that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So thanks for that. That's great and really useful. One thing I wanted to ask was at the blue level there, because I found the subject objects being stated as heaven and earth kind of, I don't know, it didn't quite hit with me there. And but it also made me reflect and think the blue thing is actually really quite complex, isn't it? Because you have spirit in flesh. It's situated between a heaven and an earth, or a hell, or whatever you want to say, you know, dual or tripart. And also it's on a kind of journey, and it can go either direction, and it's, you know, it's really quite a complex view of self there, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the other way to do the blue diamond would be the subject and object would be the soul and the world, or the soul and the body, and that generates the world of multiplicity there. Blue is complex because there's so many different versions of it. I had to choose one way of doing it in one tradition, so I chose the Christian way of doing it. There would have been a Hindu and Buddhist way of doing it as well, which would have used different terminology. But I think the underlying deeper structure would be very similar. These are kind of surface differences. And I think that's true of almost every stage there. There are different ways of doing it. So that's why I said at the beginning, this is kind of just one version of how to understand how the diamond evolves. I think the deeper insight is that these different aspects of the diamond, like wholeness and multiplicity, subject and object, these are very fundamental aspects of our experience that deepen and morph into different shapes, if you like, as we develop. Less span, more depth as we develop. And the diamond is one way of modeling how that transformation can happen. Yeah. But yes, I think that blue version could have been done in other ways as well. Definitely. Veronica.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to say anything different than what you've just been saying, but well, you're really making my mind sort of stretch, because the diamond model can be applied in different ways. And because going upwards goes towards non-duality, but yet you were applying the framework at each level. So I was like, oh, this is hurting my brain, because as we go up to non-duality, we don't want to put a frame around it. But yet we kind of have to if we're taking it through the stages. And I think that's kind of what Steve was bringing up with the blue. So it kind of forces us to give it that conceptual framework for each stage. But I was enjoying some of them. Like I thought E equals MC squared was clever for that kind of upwards sweep energy and matter. So anyway, it was just, you were making my brain do some exercises and some backflips. So I think that was good. So thanks.
Oh, great. That's what I'm here for. Make everybody's brain hurt, including mine. Yeah, I mean, non-duality, even if in some sense non-duality is the final stage of development, we speculate. In some sense, the intuition of non-duality is always present, I think. And that's why I'm including it as a universal that's there in some sense all the way up, just to help us to make sense of that ultimate unity of the entire realm of experience at every level. And I think that's one reason why maybe state experiences of non-duality can happen almost at any stage, because that intuition is always there. Paul?
I guess first off, thank you very much. This has really been not only informative, but it's actually been very helpful to me, and helpful in the sense of you gave me some new words and some new ways of describing issues that I've been wrestling with that I haven't been able to bring to the surface and give words to. And I'll just read right off of the, your failure to integrate perspectives, in the fact that the challenge of yellow and what drives yellow to turquoise is that, and this really hit me, is this yellow tends to be too conceptual and too intellectual, and there's not enough feeling and embodiment in it. And that's kind of very much what I've been struggling with, is how to, I understand the concepts of integration. I understand the concepts of the view that not only yellow, but even the turquoise, how the turquoise worldview sees things. But I've been struggling with that issue of how do I really embody that? How do I really feel that in a way that's not just intellectual? So again, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Brandon?
Oh, hi. Yeah,
Hi
that
there.
was great. I just want to thank you. And I also wanted to comment, I really appreciate the fact that your model gives a lot of emphasis to the ontology at the different stages. Because a lot of models, they tend to be epistemological, which is useful, but like epistemology is, of course, built upon like ontology. So I think like kind of dissecting how each stage understands being and how it understands dualisms is like very, very useful. And kind of in my mind, I kind of think of kind of like the prime directive as like the purposive context of each stage.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I would consider ontology and epistemology to be equally important. That they are in some sense the subject and the object of each stage, and it's probably phenomenology that unites the two in a greater embrace. And that's what I was aiming to get across by giving equal emphasis to both dimensions. Yeah, thank you very much, Michael.
Hey, how you doing?
Hi there.
Thank you so much for that for the presentation, and it's really exciting to see the model moving towards non-duality, because before I started working on a document with Rupert Spira talks about 3 stages towards enlightenment or non-duality, and I thought that there was actually some really interesting correlations between yellow, turquoise, and coral and his ideas, and I thought that might be something fun for people to look at. And it's like a 6-minute video too that I could dig up if anyone's interested.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, please do dig up the link and get it to all of us somehow. That would be great.
I'll post it in the comments. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Marie. And we'll make this the last one, and then I'll move on to the second half of the presentation. That's okay.
Cool.
Hi, Marie.
Thanks, Nish. Hi. So I do have a question actually at yellow. So perspectives and fragmentation of failure to integrate perspectives being triggered, etc. So I recognize in myself right now that for the majority of the time, I'm pretty good with accepting where everybody is, but there are definitely occasions where somebody shares a perspective of something and I'm just like, that's horseshit. And I mean, I suppose that maybe at a deeper level, there's some essence of truth in it, and maybe there is some unpacking anyways of that perspective that I should do. But to some extent, I think that there's also that there is, I mean, some perspectives are better than others. And so I guess I'm sort of struggling to sort of understand and apply to my own process anyways, the implicitly developmental perspectives and then falling into shadow, or excuse me, into what's it called? Fragmentation, excuse me.
Fragmentation.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Great point. Yeah, How to Integrate Horseshit is the title of my next book. But I'll 2 points I'll make in response. Number one, Yeah, we want to integrate all of the earlier stages, certainly. But remember, there are healthy and unhealthy versions of each stage.
Mm-hmm.
And what we really want to integrate are the healthy versions
Okay.
of the earlier stages, not so much the unhealthy versions of the earlier stages.
Okay.
So I'd certainly want to integrate a healthy red, because that would give me willpower and determination, which can be good things. I probably wouldn't want to integrate unhealthy red, because that would mean violence and oppression and so on. So integration has to be, I think, somewhat selective in that what we want to integrate is a healthy spiral, not an unhealthy spiral. And even though from a yellow perspective, some perspectives are better than others in the sense of deeper and more complex and more all-embracing than others, it's also true that depending on our life conditions at any given moment, we do need the earlier levels to be able to draw upon temporarily when they are required. So there is a situation where I would want to draw upon earlier healthy red and not just sit about a healthy turquoise. But it's healthy yellow and turquoise that might enable me to go back and use the earlier healthy versions of stages as and when they're required. And that's kind of what we're aiming towards, a whole spiral mobility. We can move up and down the spiral as required, rather than being stuck at one level actually is very fragmentary. And we don't get that until yellow, really. And then turquoise aims to embody that. So we want this kind of a whole spiral mobility. I think there's a word for that in Don Beck, which I can't remember, but that's basically what it's getting at.
Thank you. That's useful. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to the second part of the presentation, if that's okay with everybody.
Fantastic.
Great, thank you. So now growing up is one type of development that we've now looked at in a little bit of detail. There's another part, which is waking up, which is more to do with the mystical awakening, for want of a better term. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to look at the four main stages of waking up as described in the spiritual traditions and in integral theory. So I will share the screen again. Now, just to give a little bit of context and background, can you all see this okay? Yeah. So to give a very quick context and background for 5 minutes, which I think will give a better understanding of where these stages of waking up are coming from. I'm going to draw on another model I use sometimes called the circle model, which is a model that contextualizes these different stages of waking up and their relationship with one another. So that's the circle model. So I'll give a very quick summary of the circle model. So the circle model aims to give a description of reality based on the spiritual traditions and their ontology primarily, and epistemology. So if you look on the right side of the circle model, there's two halves. The right side, we see there what the spiritual traditions describe as the three great realms of being: gross, subtle, and causal. The gross dimension at the bottom there, that's our sensory motor world. That's the world of rocks, rivers, animals, the physical body, houses, cars. This is the world in which we live in when we're awake. This is the waking state world. The subtle realm there, that's our inner world. That's the world of emotions, mind, higher mind. That's the world in which we live when we're dreaming. That's our dream state world. And we can access that world even when we're awake through various techniques like meditation, shamanic voyaging, and so on. And this subtle world is made up of entities such as emotions, images, thoughts, visions, and so on. And at the top there, you'll see the third great realm of being, which is the causal realm. And the causal realm is the realm that the spiritual traditions refer to as the realm of emptiness, formlessness. This is the realm where we have a blissful release from all of the forms that we encountered in the gross and the subtle realm. And the causal realm is the realm that we access in deep, dreamless sleep. So every 24 hours, we're cycling through these realms. Waking state, when we're awake, gross; when we're asleep and dreaming, subtle; when we're asleep and not dreaming, causal. And there's this circle going on between gross, subtle, and causal every 24 hours, hopefully. And that entire realm is referred to, I'm referring here, as the realm of form or the realm of light. This is the realm of things, including the causal, which is the temporary cessation of things. That's the realm of form or light, the realm of experience. That's on the right side. On the left side, according to many of the traditions, no matter what is happening on the right side, we always have, at the deepest essence of our being, a pure observing awareness of these three states on the right side. And that's known in the Hindu tradition as Turiya, or the fourth natural state. So the gross, subtle, and causal are our first three natural states. Consciousness or emptiness in Buddhism is the fourth natural state. And that's that part of us that never gets involved in the world of form and light, but which always stands prior to it, merely observing it and being aware of it. And most of us are actually not aware of this part of ourselves, but it's still always operating, even if we're not aware of it. And becoming deeply aware of it is, and identifying with it ultimately, is exactly what the traditions refer to as liberation, because we're liberated from being trapped and therefore suffering in the right side. This left side is also referred to as our true self, as transcendental awareness, as the ever-present self, as divine consciousness. And then at the bottom there, you can see conscious light. That is the ultimate state where even consciousness and form are seen as being in a non-dual relationship with one another. So that in Hinduism is called Turiya Tita, which is beyond the fourth, beyond Turiya. That's true non-dualism. That's also ever-present. That's unqualifiable spirit. And that is the true and final enlightenment, according to many of the traditions at any rate. So that's a brief, very brief overview of the circle model. And what we'll find is that these four stages of waking up effectively correspond to four of these five components of the circle model. We'll have a waking up to the gross, a waking up to the subtle, a waking up to causal consciousness, and a waking up to conscious light. And we'll now briefly look at how the diamond can give us an insight into these four types of mystical awareness or mystical experience, which are the four stages of waking up. Okay, and you're all experts in the diamond model now, so I can start on this. So the first stage of the waking up process is nature mysticism, which is the non-duality of the gross realm. That gross realm, which is the sensory motor realm, when that is experienced as a non-duality, that is nature mysticism. So here, wholeness here is simply the gross realm, that totality of the gross world, the sensory motor world. The subject and object that emerge out of this gross realm is the body-mind as the subject and our sensory environment as the object. And the multiplicity that is experienced here in nature mysticism is the deep interconnection between these gross things and events. The gross world of nature, the gross world of things and events, it's all interconnected. That's a very typical way in which nature mystics talk. William Blake, he'll look at a leaf and he'll say, in this leaf, the whole of the universe can be seen. That's the multiplicity here at nature mysticism. The fragmentation here is when that interconnection between these gross things and events fails to be seen, and all these gross things and events are seen as completely separate. That's actually the waking state of most people, which from the point of view of nature mysticism is a fragmentation. And the non-duality here is that the gross whole and the gross parts are also in a non-dual relationship with one another. And that again is typically experienced as the whole being in each part. The nature mystic can look at any part of the gross realm and he sees the whole of the gross realm in that part. These are the typical ways in which nature mystics poetically often talk about their experience of the world. So a nature mystic here, if you just consider this diamond, will experience a deep connection with the physical environment. He'll even ultimately merge with nature. Mountains, oceans, the sunset all becomes a part of who he is. Shamans are often nature mystics. Shamanism can be seen as a form of nature mysticism. So we have a process of manifestation there, whereby the gross realm becomes this realm of interconnected gross things and events, and dissolution, whereby these interconnected things and events dissolve back into the gross realm. So as we move from the gross into the causal, we get what I'm calling here deity mysticism, which is the non-duality of the subtle realm. Now, in the subtle realm, what we see is, and this is our dream state made conscious, is we have a profound encounter with what is often interpreted at whatever level of growing up one might be, as a profound encounter with the divine, which is often described as light, love, energy, the personal deity. This is our meeting with God. That's our deity mysticism. And ultimately, we may even merge in some sense with the personal God. Examples here might be Jesus, some mystics in Buddhism, or in fact, even the divine that is encountered at this level can also be encountered as Jesus, as the Buddha, as Shiva, for example. Examples of mystics at this level are saints, prophets. We can speculate Moses, the Prophet Muhammad, Abraham. These guys were maybe experiencing some kind of deity mysticism. So the diamond at this level. So the wholeness here is that totality of the subtle realm, which we experience and encounter in the dream state. At the level of wholeness, we see a union between the soul and the deity. In integral language, this is often referred to as the high subtle. The subject and object division that occurs in this subtle realm is the soul, which is the subtle subject, and the deity, which is the subtle object. And the multiplicity that occurs between the soul and the deity is a communion between the soul and the deity. And I contrast that with the union at wholeness. So at the level of multiplicity, the soul and the deity are in communion with one another, but they're not in union. That's the low subtle. At the level of the wholeness of the subtle realm here, the soul and deity achieve a union with one another. That's the high subtle. To give you an example, again, from the Jewish Christian tradition, Moses, we could say, or even the Prophet Muhammad would have achieved a communion between the soul and the deity. So Moses communed with God up on Mount Sinai, but he never achieved a union with God. That would be unthinkable at that stage. But Jesus, instead of merely saying the Father is greater than I, which he did say, but he also said, I and the Father are one. So Jesus progressed from the Mosaic low subtle to the high subtle, where the soul and deity are now in union, and he can say, I am one with the Father, which Moses couldn't say. So that's the difference between wholeness and multiplicity here in the subtle realm. And those are the two aspects of deity mysticism, communion and union. Fragmentation here, the soul and deity separate. They fragment away from one another. And mystics often describe this separation as the dark night of the soul. So, for example, in some of the Christian mystics, Saint Teresa of Avila or Saint John of the Cross, they'd already experienced this deep communion between soul and deity, multiplicity. Then they spent a period of time where they just couldn't get that again. And they went through what they refer to as the dark night of the soul, which was a separation between the soul and the deity. And that is a fragmentation in the context of the deity mysticism. Non-duality here. Well, here, the union between soul and deity and the communion or the difference between soul and deity, their oneness and their difference are both true equally. So what we see here is a unity in difference between soul and deity. And that's described in some of the traditions in Hinduism. That's described in one of the forms of Vedanta, where one is both in union with God and also different from God at the same time. And there's no contradiction between those two positions. So that's the non-duality at deity mysticism. So we have a process of creation, the subtle union manifests as communion and even separation, and a process of salvation whereby we regain that union that we once had at the high subtle level. Okay, so now we'll move to formless mysticism. And this includes both the causal and the consciousness. I've combined the two just for simplicity because they can be quite similar. And here, formless mysticism, this is about encountering the ground of all being. Now, formless mysticism takes two main forms. One is an absorption in void. So when the mystic here is absorbed in void, nothing arises in his awareness. This is effectively dreamless sleep, but in a conscious state. And here what one is experiencing is the impersonal God or Godhead. In Hinduism, this is referred to as nirvikalpa samadhi. In Buddhism, it's nirodha. Individuals who might have experienced this, the Buddha, Lao Tzu, Jesus, historically, maybe. The other way in which one can experience formless mysticism is, if you remember the circle model, you can experience it as the causal, but you can also experience it as consciousness on the left of the circle model. And that's what we can call the witness consciousness. Here, what one is experiencing is a pure featureless awareness. One is effortlessly witnessing the three states without identifying with any of them. That is the seer that cannot be seen. So let's look at the diamond now. So the level of wholeness here at formless mysticism is what is referred to in integral theory now as the high causal. This is the realm of dreamless sleep. This is the void. This is the zero out of which everything emerges and back into which everything goes. This is the nothingness that's at the ground of everything, according to these mystical traditions. Subject and object that emerge out of void, now they correlate with these two types of formless mysticism that I've mentioned. The subject is the witness, that's the causal subject. And when that is experienced, that can, when stabilized, become a structure of consciousness, a permanent realization, a permanent structure. The object that emerges out of the high causal here is emptiness. That, if you like, is the causal object. We don't identify with emptiness, but we can experience it. And that's the formless mysticism, the first type of formless mysticism I talked about. And that can be experienced as a state, but not as a structure. That's a temporary absorption, but not a permanent structural change, structural shift. So we have causal subject, that's the witness. And one of the things that the witness can witness is the causal object, which is emptiness, the void, the zero out of which everything comes. And the multiplicity here at in formless mysticism, well, because this is formless, we're not going to see here different parts, because that wouldn't be formless anymore. But what the multiplicity here is the potential for manifestation. Formlessness can potentially manifest as the world, but doesn't actually do so in the realm of the formless. So multiplicity here is the potential for manifestation. And that in integral theory, that's referred to as the low causal. We can think of that as the singularity or the one out of which everything comes. So the high causal is the zero, and the low causal is the one. So the zero, and this is in Taoism, the Tao becomes the one becomes the two, and so on. Well, the high causal is the zero, the Tao, that's the void, the impersonal God. And that becomes the potential for manifestation, which is the one, the low causal unity, the singularity. That's the personal God, if you like. And when manifestation takes place, but in a place that is fragmentary, a place that is out of harmony with the void, with that ground of all being, we get, I'm just using Hindu language there, we get Maya, we get deception and illusion of all forms, of all types. So on the left there, as the high causal void manifests, we get the appearance of the world. And as the world then disappears back into the void, we get the disappearance of the world back into the high causal. And the non-duality here is just the oneness of the entire causal realm, high and low. The zero is the one, and ultimately the one is the many. They're all not different ultimately from one another. And the final stage here of waking up, non-dual mysticism. There is only God. Nothing exists except for the divine. So here, if you recall the circle model, what we realize is that the witness is actually none other than these three states. The witness is the same or non-different to the thing that it's witnessing. And mystics who realize this are sometimes referred to in the East as the siddhas. Examples of this might be Nagarjuna from Buddhism, Shankara from Hinduism, Plotinus from the Western philosophical tradition. So the wholeness here is the causal realm. This is both void and unity. This is the zero and the one, the ground of all being that lies at the ground or the root of everything. This manifests as the subtle, and in the subtle we get the subject and the object, which is the self and the other. And the subject and the object, there is an interplay between them, which generates the gross world of space-time. That's multiplicity. Causal, subtle, gross, subtle, causal. When the gross world of space-time moves out of alignment with the ultimate truth of the causal void and unity, we, in other words, when we lose sight of wholeness, putting it in easier language, we fall into delusion and suffering. The totality of delusion and suffering is ultimately fragmentation from a non-dual point of view. And non-duality here is the realization that actually gross, subtle, and causal all have the same taste. They're all just different flavors of the same non-dual reality. So non-duality here is just that one taste of gross, subtle, and causal. So again, we see there on the left the appearance, causal becomes subtle, becomes gross, and the disappearance, gross becomes subtle, becomes causal. And that's the fourth of the four main stages of waking up that in this particular framing of it. So I've gone through that very quickly. I know this needs to be gone into a lot of detail, but that's a very quick overview of how not only do we see transforming, morphing diamonds as we grow up, but we also see morphing diamonds as we wake up. And when we experience a particular state of waking up, our understanding of it will be largely dictated by what stage of growing up we have reached. So you can have three different people all experiencing non-dual mysticism. One is blue, one is orange, one is green. They'll all tell you three completely different things about what they've actually experienced. And that's how we get an interplay between the waking up diamonds and the growing up diamonds. And their interplay produces the entire network of beliefs and faiths and mystical descriptions that you see all over the world. It's ultimately due to this interplay between the growing up, between the waking up and the growing up. So that's the end of the presentation. So I'll open it up again to questions or comments. Hopefully you're all still awake in the normal sense of the term, not in any mystical sense of the term. I'm sure you're that already.
I beat you, Paul. I never think to use the raise my hand thing, so I think I'm getting the hang of it. So,
Marie,
sorry, Nisha, are you ready?
that's okay. I'm always ready.
Okay. I was just looking maybe for some more details or description around the Maya in the previous slide.
Okay. So basically, Maya is the Hindu term for illusion, which basically means we're perceiving things wrongly or incompletely. And one of the ways in which we do this is to perceive the gross world of things and events without grounding it in a deeper awareness of the subtle and the causal, which is what most people do. Most of us are not continuously aware of the causal. So the gross world for us simply becomes lots of separate things that don't have much relationship with one another. In order to truly realize the unity and the oneness of the separate things in the gross, we need to truly realize that. That true realization can only come from a deep realization of their true oneness, which is realized at the causal. And that can be realized either as emptiness, zero, or as the ground of all being, oneness, the zero and the one. If we don't realize that zero and one of all existence, existence for us will necessarily be a conflict between lots of different things, because we can't see that they're really different expressions of the same thing, which is the causal reality. And that's the Hindu prescription, but the diagnosis of why there is suffering in the world. That's what I've drawn on when I use the word. Multiplicity without wholeness falls into fragmentation. The parts become fragments.
Would it be somewhat like sort of zooming in and zooming out, of course, at evolution and of our evolution, and having a sort of understanding or appreciation or an accepting anyways of that, and some sense anyways of like the evolutionary impulse?
Yeah, in a sense, because as we evolve, in the sense of growing up, as we're developing, we are effectively zooming out. We're effectively getting a bigger and bigger context in which to experience reality. In that sense, as we zoom out, the potential for fragmentation reduces, because there is in that an implicit progression towards unity as we evolve through growing up, which is why the speculation exists that as growing up continues and continues, we may eventually see a merging with waking up. Because waking up really is a glimpse into those even higher levels of unity that growing up hasn't reached yet. So this is why maybe, we don't really know, but maybe post-turquoise, growing up will start to intersect with waking up. So the evolutionary impulse, in a way, we could again speculate, it's actually the footprints of causal in the gross. Yeah. So wholeness has left its footprints in the world of multiplicity by means of implanting that eros within each one of us, which is usually unconscious. So maybe self-organizing dynamics and evolutionary progression is in some sense driven by this implicit impulse towards ultimately towards the causal. Does that answer your question, or did I just talk
thank you. Now I have a better appreciation. Thank you. Better understanding. Thank you.
Paul.
Yeah. Lower my hand here. I'm doing a little understanding check here. Again, from the model, you indicated that, you know, in the realm of form and light, we can experience, obviously the gross is experienced through wakefulness. Deity mysticism it can or is experienced through dream sleep, and then dreamless sleep is where there's access to the causal realm, or the formless mysticism.
Yes.
And in those, I mean, I'm going to categorize those as kind of wired, built within us that doesn't necessarily need any proactive anything. I mean, we all have wakeful times. We all have, dream sleep when we're in REM, and then there's dreamless sleep. The difference between in there is that gross and subtle are their perceptual nature. We perceive what we see in wakefulness. We perceive something in dream sleep, but we don't perceive anything in the causal. And then you also, and then I'm not saying you necessarily would imply this, but it's my understanding that, or you did say that the formless can be accessed or through tapping into the witness. It seems like that is something that requires proactive meditation in order to perceive the causal realm. The same thing could be said for the emptiness consciousness side. Maybe, and I wrote here, even more meditation will get you to the other one. Does that match with what your understanding of it is?
Yes, I think so. So the gross, subtle, and causal, we circle through those every 24 hours, quite naturally, just through the way that we're built. That cycle is built into our makeup. But when we experience the dream state or the dreamless state, we do it unconsciously. We're not usually conscious that we're dreaming when we're dreaming. We're just dreaming. And we're certainly not usually conscious in any way when we're in our deep dreamless state. Subtle and causal mysticism would be to bring an awareness of those realms that we unconsciously encounter in dreamless sleep and the dream state, consciously and deliberately into our waking state. So that realm, that inner realm that we unconsciously encounter, for example, when we're dreaming, through practice, we make that conscious when we're awake. So there is this unconscious natural cycle through the three realms. But if we want to make them into true waking states, then that can demand practice to bring those realms into conscious awareness when we're awake.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, the transcendental witness on the left, yes, normally we wouldn't normally be cycling through that in the same way. But the mystics claim that's still always present. It's just that we're not accessing it at all, usually. That awakening can happen spontaneously, or more usually it's the result of serious sustained practice. So really, maybe this conscious and unconscious distinction will be helpful here. We can traverse this whole circle consciously, which we're all doing to some degree, or we can do it, unconsciously, which we're all doing to some degree, or we can do it consciously, which is essentially what mysticism is and awakening is.
Okay, so mysticism, not just deity, formless, or non-dual, but in a sense, could you say that some of that proactive accessing the witness, shall we say, could be achieved through nature mysticism? Shamanic practices, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, it is possible to access. There are records of people accessing the witness at gross, subtle, and causal levels, yes.
Okay.
One doesn't need to go through gross, subtle, and causal to then necessarily fall into the witness.
Right.
There are gross witnessing, subtle witnessing, and causal witnessing states. Although typically for it to be stable and permanent, often one needs to go through the entire process because there's the transcendental include mechanism here.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve.
Yeah, I've got two questions, if you don't mind. One more related to sort of growing up, and the other more related maybe to waking up. But
Okay.
So the first question is, in lots of different traditions, when you have enlightened masters or whatever, they'd often almost say it doesn't really matter where you're at on the stages or the levels or whatever, and that if you see it, you'll see it. If you see what I mean. So because I wonder, is there an implicit thing in your thing where you're effectively saying you've got to effectively reach turquoise in the growing up stage to have a kind of full and complete waking up? Or do you know what I mean? Is there any correspondence between your waking up and your growing up, other than interpretation or putting into concepts? So I guess that's the first question. Go for that one if you want first.
Sure. So I think that it's possible. I mean, I think looking at the literature, it's certainly possible, it seems, to experience the waking up states, at least as temporary states, no matter pretty much what level of growing up you are. And the evidence for that is in the literature, we can see purple, red, blue, right up to turquoise interpretations of each of the waking up states, which would suggest that these states are always accessible, independent of how grown up you are. And my speculation is that, my suggestion is that the vast majority of mystical literature comes from blue. If you look at the traditions historically, most historical mystics tend to interpret their waking up states from the growing up stage of blue in religious language. Secular mysticism, if you like, is a relatively recent phenomenon, I think, in any major way. As for whether you need to have gone all the way up to turquoise to then experience waking up, we don't really know. But one possible speculation is that we need to go to turquoise and beyond for the waking up states to become growing up stages. Prior to that, they will be temporary glimpses or insights or perceptions, which we will then interpret based on where we are growing up. But to be permanently established in that state 24/7, so that that state becomes your interpretative stage, rather than just a state that is interpreted by a stage, that would be a post-turquoise realization. Now, Dustin DiPerna, if you're familiar with the work of Dustin DiPerna, he's an integral theorist. He suggests, and this makes sense to me, that in addition to states and structures, there's a third dynamic called a vantage point. And a vantage point is essentially a permanent state. So, for example, when the Buddha achieved his nirvana, that wasn't a temporary state which he then gets a glimpse of and then comes back and interprets through orange, and then it's just orange after that. Something has permanently shifted. It's probably not a growing up stage post turquoise, because there's no evidence, I don't think, that the Buddha went through green and yellow and turquoise. His thinking was blue orange, and yet the realization was permanent. So I would suggest that states can be temporary or permanent. And there is a distinction between a permanent state and a permanent structure. The distinction is that the permanent state is the permanent experiential realization. And the permanent structure is the permanent framework through which that permanent experience is permanently interpreted. But that doesn't make the state structure. So we have temporary states, which is the way state is normally used. We have a permanent state, which is the vantage point in this framing. And then we have our structures. So we actually have an interplay of three things: state, structure, vantage point. Most mystics are probably having states, which are then interpreted through structures. But the greatest realizers, for example, like the Buddha or Ramana Maharshi or whoever, who seem to be permanently transformed into a different kind of being, they're probably dealing with vantage points. But they're still interpreting largely blue and orange. So it's not a post-turquoise structure, but it is a permanent state.
But the structure might be using might be just to speak to their time, right? So
that is possible.
Yeah. that they're just skillful means. They're just responding to the context they find themselves in, to speak in a language that's interpretable by that milieu or whatever. Yeah,
and that's possible. But although my suggestion is that that would have to be speculative, because we don't really know. And the reason I'm a little suspicious of that is because even some of the highest realizers still tended to be a little bit sectarian. So, for example, Adi Shankara, the founder of Vedanta, now he was a very deep realizer of the witness consciousness. So, a permanent state realization of the witness, maybe even non-duality, but certainly the witness. And yet he was so opposed to Buddhism that he drove Buddhism out of India.
Yeah.
Because he believed Vedanta is the only true way. Now, that would suggest a blue orientation, not a green, yellow, turquoise orientation. So it's possible, yeah, it is skillful means, definitely, but it might not be. It might simply be that some of these mystics, no matter how great they were as mystics, were still not as grown up as they could have been. That's also the other possibility.
Yeah.
We don't.
And
really
then my second question does tie into this in terms of the comments you said at the end. It's a slightly technical question, but I read a distinction in a Buddhist text between Dhammatta, which is the realm of all phenomena, all possible experience, and Dharmakaya, the wisdom body of an enlightened being. And he said that the Dharmakaya contains all mental states that are consistent with the knowing of true nature of reality or whatever. So it's once you've had the awakening, it's then your mind almost can't actually know, it can no longer take all phenomenal states because it knows the truth of emptiness or whatever. So in some senses, there's actually a kind of separation of Dhammatta into enlightened state. It's nirvana samsara, but that's almost the distinction, that it's all mental states that are cognizant of the nature of reality. I'm just wondering how that fits into what you just said and your model, if at all.
Nice, easy question. So the Dharmakaya, I think, corresponds to the causal, I think. So the Dharmakaya is the realization of the causal or the causal realm. Dharmata, I think, corresponds to multiplicity, some kind of multiplicity, the interconnection of all phenomena in the phenomenal world. If one is permanently established in the Dharmakaya, my speculation is that one would have sufficient insight to be able to use the lower levels and realms in a skillful way when required, but would no longer be deluded in the sense of being trapped in some of these lower stages. So one gains freedom from these samsaric perceptions, but one can still, skillful means, can still use them in one's own life and in others' life without being constrained by them or trapped in them. And this is a kind of dharmata, because dharmata is the interconnection of all views and the interconnection of all the manifest world. That's kind of what I'm thinking here. Does that kind of resonate?
Yeah, I have to mull on it, I think. I mean, yeah. But thank you. Thanks.
You're welcome. Yeah. Brandon.
First off, just thank you for the whole presentation. It's been great and very informative. So just for where I'm coming from, I'm still coming to a lot of this as like an outsider, not having like direct experience with a lot of this stuff. So maybe you could clarify something for me.
Sure.
So like, for example, these higher realms and the gross subtle causal distinction, would it be more helpful to think of that in phenomenological terms? Or is this also a metaphysical schema as well? Or is it more of a thing where there's no real distinction between the two, like it's both?
It can be any of those depending on your point of view. I mean, certainly phenomenological. Gross, subtle, and causal are phenomenological realms of experience. It's possible to then translate that into a metaphysical scheme if one is inclined to do that. And most mystical traditions do that. Yeah.
Would you say those can be metaphysically neutral, like as far as like their claims? Like, is there anything kind of like specific attached to that, or is it kind of like you can kind of like mold it into different types of like metaphysics?
Yeah, I mean, the different traditions, there are many, many different traditions that do mold these different realms quite differently. And one can also take a post-metaphysical view towards this. So we don't have to buy into the metaphysics. We can still acknowledge the authentic phenomenology of these states without having to project a metaphysics behind them.
Yeah, the second part is usually kind of what I struggle a little bit more, because it's very easy to kind of understand like the phenomenological like aspect of it, as far as just kind of like understanding like metaphysical claims, especially for things that I don't necessarily have direct experience in, is like more difficult.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think this actually has to do with the growing up sequence. I think in the earlier stages of growing up, purple, red, blue, early orange, we're more inclined to take the phenomenological reality of this and create metaphysical schemes. That's just what those earlier stages of growing up do. I think as we move to the higher stages of growing up and we start to deconstruct our metaphysics, we start to understand, for example, in the Western philosophical tradition, we start to understand some of the insights of Kant, for example, and move to a post-Kantian view. Metaphysics becomes more difficult to sustain. So I think this then in the later stages, high orange, green, yellow, turquoise, we can move to a more post-metaphysical view and see this purely in terms of phenomenology without having to commit to any, and we remain neutral with regards to any metaphysical claims, which is simply more in keeping with what orange, green, yellow, turquoise now knows.
Oh, thank you. That resonates with me. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Hi, Kirsty.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to add something to your discussion about the states and stages, because I've studied theory of Fallon, and she has done research about how the states and stages interpenetrate. And you mentioned the vantage point, and I'm not sure if the vantage point means the same for you as for her, but she says that certain states are needed for the vertical evolution. So this vantage point is a state which is needed. So there are certain vantage points at every level which are needed for that level to open and integrate. So some of these states are needed and the others are not necessary. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think the word states covers a whole wide range of phenomena. What I'm referring to, what is referred to here as the waking up states, are the waking up states that we encounter in the mystical traditions. I think Terry O'Fallon's states that are required to make that transition between the stages, I think are states, but they're not necessarily the waking up states that we're talking about today. So I think that's a slightly different scheme and a slightly different use of the same terminology. Yeah. I don't know if that helps. I don't think she's talking about exactly the same states that I'm talking about with the waking up here. I think these are kind of intermediary states that are necessary, because the dynamic between each, as we've discussed, the dynamic between each stage is that what was subject at one stage becomes object at the next stage. So we need to develop some kind of witnessing capacity of a given stage to be able to move to the next stage. And when that witnessing capacity emerges for the first time between stages, we can think of that as a state. And then that state becomes integrated and becomes a permanent realization at that next stage, which is then a structure. But I think that witnessing capacity that occurs all the way up is also, we can certainly refer to those as states and vantage points. But I think that might be slightly different to the mystical states and vantage points that I'm talking about here. So I think they're related, but they're not exactly the same thing. That's what I think. Does that help?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of similarity to what you said and what I learned from Terry, but since I don't know these mystical states and what you're talking about as well as I know hers, so I cannot tell.
Yeah, we'll have to discuss that maybe in more detail when we talk. Yeah.
So thanks, Nish, as always. I think we've all learned a lot, and you've given us a lot of food for thought. And I think I'm going to have to rewatch this and sort of chew over all this data and sort of transmission that you've given us. So thanks so much, and look forward to continuing this discussion with you in the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and yeah, hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.